My name is Cecilia, and I'm 32 years old. I've been married to Richard for 8 years, and for most of that time, I thought we were happy. Richard is 34, and I loved him deeply. I believed he loved me too. But one morning at breakfast, everything changed in a way I never expected. Richard looked at me across the table and said something that made my heart stop. He told me he couldn't live like this anymore. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. What was wrong? He explained that he couldn't continue living with my mother in our house. He felt like a stranger in his own home, he said. The words hit me like a cold wave. I didn't know what to say. I loved Richard with all my heart, but I also loved my mother. They were both so important to me. How could I possibly choose between them? Richard's face was serious, more serious than I'd ever seen it. Then he said the words that would haunt me for days. He told me I had to choose between him and my mother. It was one or the other. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could he ask me to make such an impossible choice? When I asked if he was serious, he simply said yes. He couldn't stay if my mother stayed. I sat there in shock, wondering how we had come to this point. We had been happy before, hadn't we? Or had I just been fooling myself? Richard stood up from the table and told me to think about it. He needed my answer soon. Then he walked out the door, leaving me sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at the wall. My mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer. What should I do? How could I break my mother's heart? How could I lose my husband? What if I made the wrong choice and lost them both? I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life, and I wanted to cry. That evening, my mother called me. She could hear something was wrong in my voice. When she asked if I was okay, I wanted to say yes, but I couldn't lie. I told her we needed to talk. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Then she asked if it was about Richard. My heart ached. How did she already know? I admitted that Richard wanted her to leave. After another painful pause, my mother said that if this was what I wanted, she would go. I quickly told her no, that I didn't want her to leave, that I didn't want to lose her. But she reminded me that I had a husband now, and I needed to choose my marriage. I called Richard that same night, desperate to find a solution. When he answered, he immediately asked if I'd made my decision. I tried to explain that my mother had nowhere else to go. He said he understood, but he still couldn't live like this. It was her or him, he repeated. No matter what choice I made, someone I loved would be hurt. I felt trapped and terrified that I might lose both of them. That night, sleep was impossible. By morning, I knew I had to try something different. I asked Richard to stay for breakfast and invited my mother to sit with us at the table. The silence was unbearable. I told them we needed to find a solution together, as a family. Richard immediately said there was no solution, that he'd already made himself clear. My mother looked down at her hands and said she could leave that very day. I shouted that this wasn't what I wanted. Then Richard said he would leave instead. I felt my heart shatter into pieces. I begged Richard to listen. I explained that my mother had no money and no home. If she left, she would be completely alone. Richard replied that if he stayed, he would always feel like a visitor in his own house. Then he said something that cut me deeper than anything else. He called our marriage a mistake. When I asked if he really believed that, he didn't answer. He just stood up and said he was going to work, and when he came back, he wanted my final answer. My mother went to her room to pack. I sat alone at the kitchen table again, feeling like my world was falling apart. I wondered if love was really enough, if family was really enough. Maybe sometimes love meant letting go, but who should I let go of? The woman who gave me life, or the man I chose to build a future with? I heard my mother moving around in her room, heard the sound of her suitcase being dragged across the floor. She was really leaving. I waited for Richard to come home, hours stretching into darkness. I called him, but there was no answer. I sent messages with no reply. Fear filled my chest as I wondered if I'd already lost him. Finally, the door opened and Richard walked in looking tired and angry. He asked for my decision, and I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Then my mother appeared, carrying her suitcase. She announced she was leaving, and Richard wouldn't have to worry anymore. Richard said good, that everything was fine now. But nothing felt fine. It felt completely wrong. As my mother walked toward the door, Richard stood beside me and said we could finally have a real marriage. I wanted to feel happy, but I felt empty instead. I looked at Richard, then at my mother, and suddenly I saw everything clearly. This wasn't love. Love doesn't force impossible choices. I called out for my mother to wait. Richard asked what I was doing, but I knew exactly what I needed to say. I told my mother she didn't have to leave, that she was my family and my heart. Then I turned to Richard and said that while I loved him, I would not abandon my mother. Richard laughed bitterly and said I was making a mistake. I told him no, I was choosing what was right. I was choosing real love. He stared at me for a long moment, then said goodbye and walked out the door without looking back. The house fell silent. I turned to my mother, who looked worried, and I told her we were going to be okay. She smiled, and I smiled too. I had expected to feel broken, but instead I felt free. Love isn't about forcing someone to choose. Losing Richard wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something better. Maybe someday I'll find love again, love that's stronger and kinder. But today I chose myself. Today I chose my family. Today I chose what real love actually means.